but let me see. Facebook can be tricky
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah. It says it's streaming live.
Okay. So, all right. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm the Behavioral Health Director here at Two Feathers Native American Family Services. I'm also part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Tolowa Native American. And I'm glad to be on here with Jill Freedman, our guest today, as well as my colleague, Jennifer Oliphant, and a little bit about Two Feathers for those of you that may be tuning in on our speaker series for the first time. We're a family service agency in Humboldt County, which is about 5 hours north of San Francisco, right on the beautiful Pacific Ocean. And we primarily serve Native American youth and families. We have a behavioral health team. We also have cultural programs. We also have a RAP model that's called Making Relatives, and we really try to provide intensive services to youth, Native youth and families. And one of those, which we're excited about to talk about today, is providing psychotherapy, family-based counseling to youth and families, and really using a lot of the theories, practices, ideas from narrative therapy. This is our first time talking about narrative therapy, although Jennifer and myself are trained in narrative therapy. And we believe we have one of the foremost experts in narrative therapy, Jill Freedman, on with us today. So I'm going to throw it over to Jennifer for her to introduce herself and then to introduce Jill.
Thanks, Virgil. Hi, my name is Jennifer Oliphant, and I am the Checks Hope for Tomorrow Grant Program Director here at Two Feathers. I provide clinical supervision to the therapists within that program, and we're an intensive counseling program aimed at preventing suicide. And it is, so I have been learning and practicing narrative therapy for the last 6 years. And so it's an absolute honor to be able to introduce our guest, Jill Freedman. I can't believe I get to interview her. And Jill is a co-director of Evanston Family Therapy Center and founding member of the Chicago Center for Family Health. She's internationally recognized for her advances in narrative theory and training, and she's received the 2009 award for the innovative contribution to family therapy and has co-authored more than 30 journal articles and book chapters in 3 books. So thank you so much, Jill, for coming and talking to us. We only have an hour with you, and so I want to toss it over to you right away so that you can maybe kind of start with an overview of what is narrative therapy.
Okay, so before I begin, I just would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land where my center, Evanston Family Therapy Center, is located. The Nishnaba group here, which I had been calling the Potawatomi, but I think their preferred name is Nishnaba. And and we're in Evanston, which is part of the larger Chicago, the greater Chicago area. So I'm gonna just start with a really brief set of ideas about narrative. And then if people have questions, we can hear those. And then I thought I might talk about ways of structuring work with families and couples. Okay, so I hope this works. I'm gonna, yeah, oh no, it didn't do exactly what I thought. Okay. Okay. So as I was saying to Jennifer as we were getting started, that I would probably pick different things that I thought were the most important characteristics of narrative therapy on different days. And I think that that's an important thing probably about narrative, that it has a lot of different ways that it responds to different kinds of problems. And it sort of depends what kind of work you're doing. But these are some things I was thinking about as I was preparing to speak with you. Oh, and 2 steps back, I just want to thank you, Virgil, for inviting me. And I'm happy to be here. Getting off to a really racing start, but I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so this is supposed to, yeah. So The first idea is that people are the privileged authors of their own stories. I think this is a really important idea, and that is really different from a lot of kinds of psychotherapy. It means that we believe that people know more about their own experience, about what's helpful to them, than an expert does. And this idea really shapes the kind of therapy we do because it's much more collaborative and it much more is always asking people, is this helpful? Is this going in a direction you want to go? It's really trusting that people have a lot of knowledge about their own life and about what's useful. So I think it's really a central part of the work. The second idea I was thinking about in preparing is that people have relationships with problems but are not themselves problematic. So Michael White talked about people and problems being separate, and that what we're doing is we're not trying to fix somebody or change somebody or having somebody adapt, but we're more having them think about what kind of relationship they want to have with the problem, which might have to do with moving away from it. It might have to do with it's having a smaller place in their life. It might have to do with they're having a different understanding of it. But this is really important because it speaks to identity, that we think that people have multiple possibilities and that because they're engaged with the problem, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. Another implication of this is that we're looking at the sociocultural context, the ideas in the culture about how people should be or shouldn't be, and whether a person or family fits with that or doesn't fit with that. We think those are all part of what makes something be thought of as problematic, rather than something about a particular person or a particular relationship. We have the idea that identity is relational. I'm really curious about whether this is a Native American idea, because I know with a lot of Indigenous people, this is really a way of thinking about identity. In Western psychology, identity is thought of as really individualistic. You are a particular way and it's sort of a fixed thing. But in a lot of Indigenous cultures, there's the idea that we know ourselves through the way other people respond to us, through the way they think about us, through what's appreciated by who we're in community with, what we're part of, what we affiliate with. I really like this idea very much. And it was an idea that's different than the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps individualistic idea that was part of the culture I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's more familiar to you.
Yes, it definitely is. And, one of the speakers that I was talking about, Megan Bang, was talking about even the idea of, our relationships with nature and how, we can be dominant control over nature or have relationships with nature. So that's a different kind of identity and how many indigenous communities see ourselves. So it's not even with, other humans, it's also with non-humans.
I'm really glad you brought that up because it's probably not something that's as obvious to me, but certainly in interviewing people in the therapy I've done with people, there could be many things that they're in relationship with besides people. Could be animals, it could be nature, it could be all kinds of things, and I think that's really important. Yeah, so we're thinking about that. And we're also thinking about identity not being fixed, that it's shifting. And so one of the phrases that Michael White, who was one of the founders of narrative therapy, talked about is how are we becoming other than who we've already been? And so we're trying, instead, in a lot of traditional therapies, there's this idea of really getting to know who somebody is, sort of peeling the layers of an onion. You probably heard that metaphor, to get to who somebody is. In narrative therapy, it's more the idea that things are shifting and changing through time. And as people step into doing something different, they become different. And as we notice that, that's creating a platform for the next step they might take that will also create a difference in their identity. So we're focusing on the shifting identity and the direction that people would like their identity to move in and what they're doing that's contributing to that, and how their participation in things other than themselves is also helping move in particular directions. I also think that something that's really interesting to me is that we're not thinking about narrative therapy as having the truth about a way to work or how things should be. We think that therapy should be fitting for the culture of the people seeking it. And for me, that's really interesting because in different contexts, different cultures, people respond more to certain parts and not to others and change them to fit. And that contributes to all of us. So in the early days, before narrative therapy had a name, Michael White and David Epstein really resisted naming it because they wanted it to change and they wanted it to grow. And one of the ways that it changes is through how it's applied in different cultures. The book publishing industry won out though, and they did eventually name it. And the word that they started using was narrative, but there were other possibilities. It didn't have to be narrative, but I really like this aspect, this narrative aspect. Before I talk more about that, I'm just curious if there are questions just about those basic ideas.
I'm looking on the Facebook to see if anybody entered any questions. One of the benefits of the live stream is we get to see questions in real time. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous and love this and identity is relational, yes, but no questions yet.
Okay. I guess a question, and I don't know if you're going to go into it, but if we're talking about like the core sort of foundation of narrative therapy, would the political side of it also, be just in the sense of Michel Foucault and that the power and taking into consideration those dominant sort of discourses? Where
Yes.
would that be at the sort of core foundation of narrative?
So when I was talking about people have relationships with problems but are not themselves problematic, and that we're looking in the larger context. So we're looking at those discourses that people don't fit with. Mm-hmm. And those, particularly if I'm thinking about families and couples, I'm looking at two different things. One is power inequities, power relations. I'm thinking, is there some idea in the larger culture that's creating a power imbalance here that's supporting the problems that people are coming to talk about in therapy? So to me, that's built into this idea. The other thing that I'm thinking about is, are there idealized images that people are trying to live up to and thinking that there's something wrong with them or their partner or their child if they don't live up to those idealized images. Mm-hmm. So very much when we talk about people having relationships with problems, we're thinking about those problems being supported in these larger cultural discourses and in power relations. Okay. Is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, and I was just, Minnesota was on my mind, and just, because I think one of the things that got me into this, into narrative therapy, was that it was one of the sort of practices that I thought took into consideration social justice and equity issues, and really worked to deconstruct and in many indigenous communities, it would be called decolonize the sort of dominant discourses and theories, because oftentimes those don't work for indigenous communities.
So can I just speak to, for a moment, it's sort of related to what you're just talking about. So Dulwich Centre in Australia, in Adelaide, Australia, along with the University of Melbourne, has a master's degree program in narrative therapy and community work. And one of the things that they've done in that program is there's a group of people who participate in that program, but one of the partnerships that I've been able to have in participating in that program is with Talia Graham Butler, who's an Aboriginal woman. And so we gave a talk on trying to decolonize narrative teaching together. And one of the things that stood out for both of us in this program was if I was teaching and the Aboriginal people had the right, it was completely built in that no matter what was going on in the room, they could leave and have their own yarning conversation outside of the room and then come back. And so I had the experience of teaching something, thinking it was really important, and the group of people would get out and get up and walk out of the room. And that was really humbling because I couldn't predict what was going to really work for them culturally. But the context that was created by Dulwich Centre made it possible for them to communicate with each other and when something wasn't culturally fitting. And what was really fantastic, I think, for everybody, was when they were willing to have some of those conversations in front of the larger group. Mm. So then we could hear some things about what wasn't culturally fitting, what it was that they were hearing that was different than their culture. And then we could think about, like, how do we incorporate this in the larger teaching space? So that was really great. So I was thinking about that when you were talking about those cultural differences. And what could have happened was that people would have felt marginalized. You know, if it wasn't set up that way, then the Aboriginal people would have just been aware that it didn't fit. And then they would have a choice. Do I just go along with this? Do I leave? You know, they would have been marginalized. But it was built in that they had, you know, that they had the right to have a voice that we would pay attention to, and that they could decide what was fitting and what wasn't fitting. And it was a real, and it is a real collaboration and partnership. I'm sure there's much more to go, and I'm sure that there are things that I don't notice, and but I feel like it's a real privilege to be able to be in on finding out what we're doing that doesn't fit, instead of just assuming everybody's going to see it a particular way.
Yeah, Jill, I really love that. And it sounds like you were able to create that space and have that kind of collaborative process within that agency. And it makes me think of, do you have a process for expanding this to maybe the kind of culture of mental health? So I guess what I'm thinking specifically is, you know, therapy should be fitting for the culture of the people that seek it, but we don't have systems that support that sometimes. And I'm wondering how you've navigated that.
I think that's really difficult. And I'm not so sure how well, you know, I mean, I can have particular relationships with particular people. I wouldn't make any claims that I've made a difference in a system. One of the things that's been really interesting to me recently, Jean, my partner Jean, and I have been doing a consultation group with psychiatric nurses. Oh. So that's been really interesting. And the reason that we're doing this consultation group now is that COVID's come into the hospital. Although their unit is a psychiatric unit, there have been people there with COVID. And so they've had to face that, and that's really changed things. And one of the things, though, that we're hearing about a lot is all of these kinds of rules and regulations and ways that things have to be done that wouldn't be fitting for narrative ideas. And we've sort of talked about the possibility of being subversive. And one of the things that we've talked about is how much easier it is to do that as part of a team than if you're just secretly trying to do it. So I'm sure that there are people who have done much more in that bigger context than I have.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I could talk about it a lot, but yeah. Okay. Should I go ahead here?
Yeah, we could maybe continue to go for a little bit with the presentation, and then, you know, we'll take some questions from the audience, and then Jennifer and I have some questions. How does that sound?
Perfect. Okay, I can make this work. Okay, so one of the things that I really like is the narrative metaphor, thinking about the narrative metaphor. And the way that I think about it is I actually have an image that I carry with me. And this is the image. If we think about each of these little lines as an experience, we could, this picture could represent your morning, or it can represent your life, depending on how you make generalizations. So when people come to therapy, they usually have certain moments that represent the experience that they want to tell you about, that they think reflect their lives. And these are stories that they've told over and over, maybe only to themselves when they're taking a shower, but maybe to their best friend. But they've usually rehearsed what they're going to tell you. That's the problem. And if we're seeing a family or a couple, they might have some of those moments that overlap, although they probably have different meanings, but they also have other things that are involved in the story that they are talking about their lives. They're thin stories. You can see there are all sorts of experiences that they've had, but only these few count. And usually that's a situation people are in when they come to therapy. So I think the single most important thing that we can do is listen for a moment that stands outside of those thin lines. Those stories don't become important by chance. Those stories those are places where people don't fit with the larger ideas in the culture, with the expectations about how they should be, with the ways that they think their children should perform in school. There are certain sets of norms and values and ideas about what should be happening. And when people don't fit with those, they have stories about how they don't fit, and those become the problematic stories. So we're listening for something that wouldn't be predicted by those stories. It doesn't necessarily have to be that those things aren't operating, but that's something that just wouldn't have been predicted by those problematic stories. And what we're doing in narrative therapy is we're connecting that to other experiences. We're hearing the stories of those experiences, and then we're creating other storylines so that eventually people and families have multiple storylines. What I really, really like about this picture is that the problem story doesn't disappear, but it looks different as just one thin line of these multi-storied lives. So that's what I'm thinking about in doing narrative therapy. I'm thinking about what stands outside of the problematic story. And sometimes we have to go back to those political stories that you were talking about, Virgil, and take them apart a little bit to be able to see beyond them. But then we find something outside of that, and we're interested in the telling and retelling of those stories. Now, when people come to therapy, usually that's not the idea that they have in mind. usually that the idea that they have in mind is that they're going to describe what's going on, and they hope that the therapist agrees with them and will sort of set straight the rest of the family members. Or they're looking at a therapist as sort of like a judge or an instructor who's going to tell them what to do or tell them who's right, or, give them ideas that's sort of going to get them back on track with what this political expectation or norm was. And so we're not up to that in narrative therapy. We want to do something really different than that. And what I'm thinking about, particularly in working with families, is how can I engage different family members to listen to one person and to really understand their story, and then to have them contribute to it in some way, and to have another family member be able to talk and for people to hear their story. So for me, it's really useful in doing that to set up a structure. And that's what I thought I might focus on a little bit today. And I think I'll tell you a story about how we first started thinking about this. This happened a long time ago. It was one of our early year-long programs. People were coming from different places to learn narrative therapy. And one of the things that we did was either Jean or I would interview each person and make a videotape of it. It was back in the days of the VHS videotapes in the box. And so I interviewed Jane, and our idea was it would be good for people to experience thinking about the questions we asked, to have that experience, and also they could have the videotape so they could look at it. And, So I interviewed Jane, and people could talk about either work or so it could be like a professional consultation, or it could be like more of an interview about some aspect of their life. They could be interviewed about whatever they wanted. And Jane decided that she wanted to talk about her marriage, which was not going very well. And so I interviewed her about her marriage. And I didn't think it was a fabulous interview. I thought it was an okay interview, not a really helpful interview, but I don't think it did damage. Anyway, she took the video, as you know, we gave it to people at the end. And about 2 weeks later, she was coming home from work, and she opened the living room door, looked inside, and her husband, Martin, was sitting on the sofa in front of the TV. The coffee table was in front of him, and on the coffee table was the box that VHS video had been in. And she looked at him as she was standing on the threshold, and he looked at her, and she was thinking, oh, should I come in? She hadn't told him about this interview. So she was really quite worried about how he would respond. But she came in, and he said, I understand some things I've never understood before. Now, she was really, really shocked to hear this, because she was pretty sure that everything that she said on this video, she had said to him in person, and they'd been in several couples therapies. She didn't think anything was new on this video at all. So she was really surprised. But in the days after that, it seemed like he understood her in some ways he didn't before. And he got this idea that the two of them should come see me in therapy, because this was the most helpful interview that he had experienced. So she didn't know if that was a good idea, but they talked about it. And finally he called me and he told me, and I said, well, you know, she's in this year-long program. It's probably not a great idea. And he said, well, after the program, you know, can we come? And I said, well, I hope things are better by then, but 6 months after the program, if they're not better, you can call and we'll see what we can do. So he called 6 months later, and he said, you know, I've been holding on to this hope. We really want to come. And so they were living in a different city. We decided, okay, we'll put aside the weekend and we'll spend as much time with you as it seems useful. Jean and I together did this. And so they came, and within the first 45 minutes, you could just see Martin so disappointed, so disappointed. And I said, how is this going for you? And he said, it's just like all the other therapy sessions. It's not helpful. We persisted. We spent a number of hours over that weekend, but it wasn't such a useful experience. And they went home, and we thought about it, and they thought about it. And then we decided to call them up. And we called them and said, we particularly wanted to talk to Martin. We said, what was so different about that, watching that video, than actually engaging in the therapy conversation? And we talked about it for quite a while, and we realized that what was different was that Jane wasn't there, that he wasn't trying to change her mind, and that there was all this distance, there was time and space, and that he could just pay attention to what she said and nothing else. And then in the therapy sessions, both with us and with other people, instead it was the two of them like trying to promote what they had to say. So we really began to think about that quite a lot. And how could we build in people really just paying attention to the other person? So we started thinking about creating a structure. And we started thinking about witnessing, how we could invite people to pay attention just to what the other person is saying, and then to reflect on that in some way. So when we first began doing this, or sometimes when we do this, we just talk to one person while we're talking about the other person in the third person, instead of talking to both of them together. And at a certain point, we will turn and ask the other person or the other people, if it's not a couple, if it's a family, we might talk to the teenage son, and at a certain point turn to the parents and ask a question. But we're not talking with him about when we talk about his parents, they're in the third person. So we're not directly addressing them. We're just talking to him until we change and address them. And then we're talking about him in the third person. Now, some people will just go right with that. But with other people, they still want to talk with each other, or they interrupt each other. And so sometimes we say something like, would you be willing to have the conversation in a different way? Because you've probably talked about this at home, right? How did it go? So can we try something different? And then we might talk with them about, if what you're doing when you're listening is you're just listening for how they're wrong, or what you would say different, then you're not really hearing them. You're going to get just as much time as they're getting, and we're going to insist that they just listen to you too. So would you be willing to do that? So we set up this listening, and then we're asking them to join in some way. So we're talking to one person while the other people are listening. And then we're asking maybe all the other people, maybe one person, we're deciding to respond. Now, we found that people can listen in a different way, but everything can be lost if I'm talking to the teenage son, and then I turn to the father and I say, what were you thinking as your son was talking? He might just tell me all the things he disagrees with. I might have completely lost what I did. So it's a really crucial moment to think about what I might say. So instead of what were you thinking while your son was talking, I might want to say something like, are you surprised to hear how many considerations your son had in making a decision to do this? What does that tell you about what's important to him? So I'm sort of offering a domain that I think is going to contribute to the son's story. And then I'm going back to the son and say, what was it like to hear your father acknowledge all the thinking that you did and how that helps him see you? Do you want him to see you that way? Now, I can ask both parents or however many people are in the family, or I can ask one, and I can do a lot of different things. But the main thing that I'm trying to do is get people to listen and understand and contribute to each other's stories. When we do that, it often makes it possible for people to join together in responding to a problem instead of wanting to contradict each other. And that's what we're hoping for. Sometimes it's really, really difficult for people to listen to each other. And so we want to offer a position from which they can really be a good witness. So the example that I often think of is I was doing a consultation interview for one of my colleagues, and she was working with this heterosexual couple who were in the process of a really messy divorce. And before the divorce, the father had introduced I think about 9-year-old daughter to the woman he was involved with, but he said that they were working on this project together. He was dishonest about the nature of the relationship, and they had gone out to several meals together. And so when the daughter discovered that the father was actually involved with this woman, and that had something to do with the divorce, she decided that she did not want to have anything to do with the father. But the father believed that the ex-wife or ex-wife to be was poisoning the daughter, and it was her fault, not poisoning the daughter against him, saying bad things against him, and that it was the ex-wife's fault that the daughter wouldn't go spend a weekend with him, for example. So it was really difficult to get these two people into the room together. And my colleague had asked me to see them because she was really worried about the daughter, who was becoming more and more upset and distressed and isolated. So what I did was I asked them what they wanted for their children. They had 3 children. The daughter was the one they were most worried about. And I asked them what they wanted for their children. And they began talking about all sorts of things that they wanted for their children. Then I said, so can we have this conversation? And the lens that you're looking through is the lens of co-parenting and wanting the same thing, the best for your children. In holding on to that lens, they could sit down and I could interview one with the other in the reflecting position. Now, I'm not saying this was easy. I would often have to say, wait a minute, remember what you're looking through is wanting the best for your child. But that was like creating a position. Sometimes we can say, create a position of friendship. Can you listen the way you would listen to a friend? How would you listen to a friend? What would you be thinking about? What would you be holding on to? And have people listen the way they would listen as a friend. Sometimes, the most extreme it's ever gotten for me was when I was seeing a heterosexual couple where the man had been violent towards the woman. She wasn't sure if she wanted the relationship. He begged her to come to therapy. And the first thing she said was, I don't know if I want to be here. I don't know if I want to be in the marriage. And I suggested after a while, we talked for a while, and eventually I suggested that I interview him without her there at all, that we videotape it, and that she and I watch it later. And that I ask her some questions, and that what she's watching for is whether it's going to be safe to come back into the relationship. So that was like, that's a really big position, but it enabled her to actually listen to some things he said and put her in a position of deciding whether she even wanted him to witness her experience. But all of these have to do, I think that's all I have here. Yeah, all of these have to do with different positions people could be in. And what it's all about is people hearing, understanding each other's stories and being able to add to them, reflect on them. And that one of the ways that we're being influential is asking questions that help them do that and break the pattern that so many families have when they're coming to therapy, where one person's being blamed or there's a lot of conflict or a lot of misunderstanding about each other's experience. So that's the main thing. I mean, that's the main idea that I was thinking would be useful to present in talking about narrative work with families. So I'm wondering at this point if you have.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. We shot through about 3 of my questions that I'd brought. So that is fantastic. And I really appreciate you sharing actual case examples. I think that's really helpful to hear the stories attached to the structure. Another thing that, so I had a lot of thoughts from what you said, but something that kind of sat out for me is one of the things I like about narrative is we're not privileging the expert, right? We're putting the client in the author seat of their own story. And I think, especially when I was newer, I interpreted that to mean we're somewhat passive, and we're not passive in the therapy process. And so the idea of you you called it positioning, but inviting the people that you're working with to take a position in the room, I really like that. And it just made me think about it in a different way than I've considered it before.
Right.
Yeah, so that was a comment. I didn't have a question off of that, but there are some pretty good questions in the, if you don't have a comment for that piece, some folks have asked, let's see, the last one by Carlos Seyri, I'm sorry if I messed your name up, Carlos. He asked, what can we do if the people only have negative stories about themselves? For example, someone with suicidal thoughts.
Well, it's a big question that I'm not sure that I could answer in an hour. But one of the things that I can say is I believe there's always other possibilities. And I think believing that makes a difference. One of the sets of ideas that I really love about narrative is called the absent but implicit. Mm-hmm. This is the idea that in order to think of something as being problematic, you have to compare it with something that you've experienced that's not problematic and that you treasure in some way. And so if somebody is thinking about suicide, I'd be really interested in what you were holding on to before you began having these thoughts, or even what you've been holding on to that's prevented you from taking your life up to now. And that might be some very small things, but they could become really useful in being told and retold and acknowledged and honored. So, I think we have to start from the point of believing that that's not all there is. It could be a big part of what there is, but there's always other things that we want to be thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. And Jill, do you have any maybe examples of how to help someone or how maybe even a newer narrative therapist might get to that point of finding some of those other stories?
Oh, I think that has to do with learning to listen. I think I almost never ask a question to get to other stories. Sometimes it's really important to take apart the problem to find out what it is that people are comparing themselves to, how the problem takes over their lives, what some of those discourses are, and then what the effects of those are, and whether they want that or not. Does that fit with what you want for your life? Because we're trying to create a gap between the problem story to be able to see beyond it. So sometimes we have to talk about the problem story first to be able to see that gap and go beyond it. But at other times we can just listen, and people say things like, most of the time I'm really depressed. And then when they say most of the time, that tells me there's sometimes they're not. And so I can be curious about those times that they're not. Or, it's so much in language. And I think the difficulty is slowing it down enough to be able to hear it. And so what I did in practicing was taping things, and they don't have to be therapy conversations. They could be, a television program, and really thinking between times, what am I hearing that's outside of what somebody's talking about, to begin to hear those small moments that don't fit with the overall story. It's really about hearing things that are a little bit inconsistent with the claims somebody's making, and being willing to very tentatively ask them questions and see where that takes us.
What an interesting idea, to tape things and practice listening. I love that. I think I'm going to have my staff do that.
Too much is going on when we're in the room with a family. Like, we have to have our ears tuned, because we're trying to get a connection. We're trying to understand, like, there's just too much going on if you're not used to paying attention to those little moments.
Yeah, it's a great point. Virgil, I saw you trying to ask
I was just wondering if, one of the things that we've done at Two Feathers is we have a program. It's a locally culturally based program that we borrow from our local traditions. And one of the themes that's come out of decolonizing, deconstructing mental health as is the power of language, and looking at how we see depression in our own language. What is that? How do we define that? And so I know that narrative therapy is very we prioritize the discourse and language. And I just wanted, for example, even calling somebody that we work with a client, and in how we write progress notes. And so I just wanted you to, I think, because it seems like language is a sort of core pillar of narrative therapy. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't call people clients. Sometimes it gets confusing in writing, but in life doesn't, so they're just people who are coming and talking with me. Also naming problems, not in expert medical language, but in ways that are experience near for them. There's a very beautiful description Michael White gives. I think I've seen a video of him doing this, but I think he's also written about it, where he's seeing a family, and the son in the family that says he has ADHD, and Michael says, "Oh, what color is it?" And then he begins talking about working with somebody else who made a painting of their ADHD, but Michael doesn't know if his is the same one or not. And they have they go on, and he eventually asks this young person if he could wake up in the middle of the night when he's having a dream about it, and be able to capture what colors it is so that they can know. It's all about people's experience is different, and there's so many different ways to represent it. And if we use objectifying medical expert language, it really narrows people's experience, and we may miss a lot. So I think I think what you've said about using cultural language is also interesting, because I don't want to assume that the language that I would use, or if I'm hearing about a color that he would paint it, that I know the meaning of that color. A lot is about not assuming that we know about other people's experience, and that's so interesting. Getting to unpack and find out what people are meaning.
And a quick, or maybe quick follow up to that is, there's the research out there about like therapist factors, like that around outcomes, and that, often the characteristics of the actual psychotherapist are, determines or not determines, but, increases successful outcomes, let's say. And so and one of the things that I took in from narrative is that narrative therapists very much come at it from a very sort of open, curious, as I think David Epstein's book, one of his books is Wonderfulness. And so I'm just wondering, like, for those new therapists and that are just, getting into the field, like, what is it about, you think, the narrative therapy and the qualities and the characteristics of the person doing narrative therapy, and how important that is, and just your thoughts around that?
Gosh, well, I think that the idea of collaboration rather than expert knowledge, I think that has to say something about where we stand as people, and I think that for many people, that's very encouraging. I think there are some people who want an expert to tell them what to do, but I think for most people, they want things to change and get better. And there's an encouraging experience in being collaborated with about that and having their experience recognized and honored. I think curiosity is really, really important. Because that leads to being able to expand things. Stories unfold. It's not like we have this course and we're going to it. We're interested, curious, and things unfold, and we can't even predict where they would go. I think there's something exciting about that. Also, I think because we're not so into rules, we're thinking about the effects of things rather than the rules, that we might be a bit freer to join people instead of like thinking so much about boundaries and being professional. So I think that the willingness to be in that position says something about the identity of narrative therapists as well.
Thank you. That's, I think part of my question was coming from, I was in a webinar yesterday using positive youth development and just the importance of being affirming and positive and strength-based with youth. And I think, part of that also is that curiosity piece, and just not coming in with an agenda and trying to find the strengths of the youth, because we do a lot of work in the schools. And so we've been unpacking discipline and consequences and labeling kids as, dropouts.
Yeah.
So I see we have some questions, but I wanted to throw it over to Jennifer. I'm going to put her on the spot. If you've got any more questions to keep this conversation going?
Well, thank you, Virgil. Man, we're about 6 minutes out and I have endless amounts of questions for you, Jill, but I thought maybe kind of a fun way to move towards concluding could be if you had any advice for new narrative therapists or new therapists that are learning the craft of narrative therapy, and maybe even also newer directors who are trying to implement the model in their agency.
The therapist part is easier, but I'll try to come back to the directors. I think the single most important thing that you can do, gosh, that was a little more direct and limiting than I meant it to be. I think something you can do that's useful is have somebody else that you're doing it with. I think that narrative therapy is different than a lot of traditional therapies. And so it's likely that if you're in a context where people are doing other things, it's really hard to keep the ideas and the worldview and the mindset. So I think it's really, really, really helpful to have somebody else who's also learning it, that you can talk with about what you're doing and share questions, and that maybe could be available to be a witness to some of what you're doing. To me, I don't think I could have done it by myself. And a lot of people in our programs find that just so helpful to be in touch with each other, to keep alive the new ideas that they're learning instead of getting pulled back into old ones. To do that with an agency, I mean, in some ways, it seems like you can, enlist the agency. I don't know. I've consulted to several agencies and a couple of schools, and sometimes the schools would take one particular idea and have it sort of go through the classrooms. So, for example, an idea at one of the schools where I worked was that kids could catch each other on doing something new, and there would be like meetings about it, and it would be posted on the bulletin board that somebody spied their friend doing XYZ, which didn't fit with the problem. These are schools for kids who've been kicked out of public school for problems. So it was, they knew what each other were supposed to be working on, and they would be spying for when the kid did something outside of that. So, and there would be lists, there would be like, a sort of contests almost in the school. That was an interesting thing. So I also did a lot of consulting particularly in agencies for people with HIV. And there was a lot of using at staff meetings narrative questions. So thinking beforehand at some big narrative questions. There would also be like a challenge at times if we're talking about a problem and somebody's like describing the problem. Could somebody else tell another story that fits the description but has different meaning, just for the possibility of a second story? And it just sort of could loosen things up a little bit.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. And so I'm imagining that might apply to in the way that you're doing clinical supervision. Do you kind of have a practice where you prepare questions ahead of time, or you have a specific format?
For individual or group, it's different. For groups, I might have like some questions beforehand that are big questions that people can, that different people can respond to sort of in rounds, but that I'll pull out specific things that they're saying to build on. Yeah. For individual supervision, what I really like to do is see a transcript. Or see some work in advance and be really, really thinking about two different kinds of questions. One is like new developments of the person so that I can ask questions to help build their story of the narrative therapist that they're becoming. And the other is moments where they could have used another practice. So to be able to say, what would have happened if you were thinking about remembering here? So just to expand the possibilities. So trying to do both of those. I think can be really helpful.
Wow, I feel like that last 5 minutes was incredibly helpful to me, and I'm probably going to move forward differently now. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for doing me that.
So we have 1 minute left, and maybe I'll toss it back to Virgil to close things up.
I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to also give you, provide an opportunity for any last words, and including maybe, your training institute out in Evanston, and also where we can find you, and just any last words.
Sure. Well, I enjoyed having this conversation, and I it was sort of a funny thing because I'm seeing two of you, but I assume that there's also other people. So hello to the other people. I'm at Evanston Family Therapy Center. We're always behind on our website, which is narrativetherapychicago.com. And I'm just really happy to be able to connect with people. I think that in this time of lockdown and self-isolation, it's really great that you're doing, I don't know if you do this regularly or it's because of this, but I'm fine. I've been in a number of different conversations that are because of this situation. And I think it's really, I really appreciate being able to connect with other people thinking about similar things. So thank you for inviting me. And I enjoyed talking with you.
Yes,
And
you're
all
welcome. And, thank you for your time and your great wisdom. And we will be, we've posted a flyer about our narrative training series. So look out for it on, or it's already out there. It's on Facebook. So we'll have another one. I think it's next week or the next week, Ronnie Schwartz. And we have 2 more. And so look out for it. And hopefully you all took something from today's talk, because I know we did. And have a good rest of the day. I know it's going to be really sunny here in Humboldt County. And so
it's really hot here and my air conditioning's not working. So I'm sort of sheen with sweat.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of living on the ocean, right on the ocean.
Yeah.
Is the weather,
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you so much, Jill. This was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.